So we turn our attention first this morning instead to the coalescing situation in Israel and Gaza, where Blinken, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, is essentially saying that there is a need for an immediate and sustained ceasefire. Now, with these stories as they develop, and with the intricacies sometimes of international diplomacy, we can walk through it together. All right, don't bite my head if I've got things wrong. But it looks to me like there has been a fairly significant sea change in feeling. The first indication of it was, of course, Chuck Schumer, the most senior Jewish politician in America, warning that Israel was in danger of becoming a pariah state. And now Anthony Blinken is in Israel ahead of a United Nations vote on a US draft resolution which supports calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, tied, of course, to the release of the hostages still held by Hamas. America, it is objectively fair to say, the United States of America, it is objectively fair to say, becoming more and more critical of and concerned about Benjamin Netanyahu's conduct and tactics in this conflict. And I want to approach this, if we can, from a thoughtful perspective. And I want to look, as we do, at the nature of change and transformation. No one could put a number on when too much would be too much. Nobody could identify, from any corner of the conversation, nobody could identify when the response of Israel to that 7th of October terror attack that left 1,200 people dead and 250 taken hostage. Nobody could put a figure or even a description upon the notion of what level of response would be too much. How much would be too much? I couldn't. I was in absolutely no doubt whatsoever about the necessity and the justification of a huge response from Israel. And yet, even as that response began, we found ourselves unable to pinpoint precisely how much would be too much. These, I think, are the three stages of the story. And until the third, I suspect that most of us were in agreement with each other. Number one, this was an act of unimaginable horror on October the 7th, directed at the people of Israel, every single one of them, and therefore the government of Israel must respond. Number two, I don't know that the response is distinguishing carefully enough between Hamas terrorists and Palestinian civilians. And if it doesn't distinguish enough between Hamas terrorists and Palestinian civilians, then the horror is replicated in many ways for many observers on the outside. So that then for me became a fear that what was driving Netanyahu and his most vocal supporters was a belief that they were entitled to destroy the whole of Gaza, that there was no limit upon civilian suffering high enough to stop Israeli aggression. And that's a terrifying thought for a number of reasons. But from our perspective, it's chiefly a terrifying thought because you can't prove it. And whenever you express fears that might be what is happening, you leave yourself open to accusations of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred from, in some cases, some quite sensible or ordinarily sensible people. Even when you find evidence, not only that Benjamin Netanyahu has expressed thoughts akin to that position in the past, but his cabinet is positively loaded with people who still say it now. You say Israel seems to be embarked upon the deliberate destruction of the Gaza Strip, and you are labelled Jew hater. So I think some people, and I've got a horrible feeling I'm one of them, I've got a horrible feeling that if that particular accusation wasn't so vituperative, so vicious, however confident you are that it's not true, I wonder whether we've talked about this a little less. Maybe not. Maybe I'm being a bit unfair on myself. We talked about it a fair old amount. But it is obviously an accusation designed to shut down debate and to shut down conversation. In fact, one of the Israeli government spokespeople in this country, someone you've heard from a lot, although not on this program, a chap called Elon Levy, has now been suspended from duty, something which, again, may not receive quite the coverage that you might expect in a fair and equal universe. But he's been rowing online with our Foreign Secretary, with the UK Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, over whether or not Israel is hindering the passage of aid into Gaza. Spoiler alert, it is. And yet this chap was absolutely and rather rudely and furiously denying that it was, leading to his suspension from his role as an English language government spokesman. So what do you do? Here's a really good example for you. Okay, what do you do with that? So you mentioned some numbers, and someone will remind you that you can't rely on these numbers because Hamas controls the health authority in the Gaza Strip. So the very deliberate attempt to undermine any sort of objective context for a conversation about what's going on. And of course, you can't counter it by saying, well, actually, I got my number off Reuters or I got my numbers off Channel 4 News, because they're not allowed in. So you try to denigrate the statistical claims coming out of this area to the point where you can't believe anything that you're being told, but you won't let in the actual journalists who would be able to do an objective job of doing it. You'll let in some people who have pledged their undying and unquestioning allegiance to Benjamin Netanyahu's government, who call themselves journalists in the same way that I could call myself a footballer. But you don't let in people like John Simpson and people like Katya Adler and people like Christiane Amanpour and people like Matt Fry. You don't let them in. And so how then do you deal with the fact that the Israeli Prime Minister's, or Israel's English language government spokesman has been suspended? Does that mean we can't trust anything that they say? I would never dream of making that claim. I'm just showing you what double standards sound like, what double standards look like. So there's also a comment that a few of you are reminding me of that isn't particularly relevant to today's conversation, but certainly helps with context, which is that Donald Trump's son-in-law has talked about the development potential of the port that is currently being built on the Gazan coast to try to get aid into the area because the Israeli government or forces beyond their control are preventing it from getting there via ordinary means. The denial of which seems to be the reason for the suspension of Elon Levy from his role as the Israeli English language government spokesman. I suppose you'd have to presume they think he has been mistaken or less than honest for that suspension to have been undertaken. So at 14 minutes after 10, we find ourselves wondering what's changed. What's changed? Nothing's changed. All we've seen is a continuance of what was going on last time America decided not to call for the ceasefire that the UN resolution wanted. There'll be semantic differences. There may be some meaningful and profound differences. But it is a US draft resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, tied to the release of hostages, and it is the first time that America has supported calls for an immediate ceasefire in the region. And as far as I can see, nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. So, what has changed? For you, as much as your view on the bigger picture, what has changed for you? Why has America now joined calls for an immediate ceasefire in the region, whereas previously it appeared to be in full support of everything that Benjamin Netanyahu's government was doing? What do you attribute that to? What do you think has changed? Because the fear I tried to express to you long before Chuck Schumer more or less said exactly the same thing, albeit from a position of much greater authority and experience. The thing I tried to say to you was that the haemorrhaging of support and even love for the modern state of Israel was becoming a very real and present danger. And all you have to do is talk to young people, or look at what young people are saying. Look at what public opinion in general around the world is saying. And Benjamin Netanyahu has run a very real risk, and in some ways it may already be too late. He has run a very real risk of turning Israel into a pariah state that nobody understands the actions of. Part of the problem, in my humble opinion, is the nature of discourse, the allegations of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, because it means that the conversation doesn't get conducted in an open and honest fashion. Journalists, commentators, pundits censor themselves. You want to go and have a studio debate about it, you'll have to be prepared to sit opposite somebody who is supremely comfortable with Gaza being razed to the ground, the grey areas, the people who refuse to feel more sorrow at a Jewish death than they do at a Palestinian death, or more sorrow at a Palestinian death than they do at an Israeli death. They should be the only people engaged in this conversation when it comes to analysis. You can get a government spokesperson, and you can, if you must, get a Hamas spokesperson. But if you want to speak for the ordinary people of Gaza or the ordinary people of Israel, you have to listen to people that want peace. And the conversation seems to have been dominated by people who don't want peace. And that, for me, includes Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas. And that's a tragedy. And that's the way it's gone. So what's changed? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I want you to tell me why not just America has now moved its weight behind calls for a ceasefire that it was not long ago quite diametrically opposed to, but also I would love to talk to you. And I find these conversations so much more interesting than the more traditional ones where people whose position will never shift in a million years just shout at each other. I would love to know what you think about this as someone who has followed it without having a personal investment in the issue. The phrase we normally use here is skin in the game, or a dog in the race. Somebody who doesn't have historical affiliation either to the people of Gaza or the people of Israel. Somebody who follows it in perhaps the same way that you may follow other conflicts elsewhere in the world, or other terrorist atrocities responded to by sovereign governments. Somebody who doesn't come at it with a loyalty already established, or even with a sympathy already established. I'd love to hear where your thoughts and opinions have gone on this. But we'll start with the obvious question, which I don't think has obvious answers, except possibly cynical points at the looming elections in America, which may well be part of the calculation. Let's find out. But the failure for any of us to have pinpointed how much would be too much. For Benjamin Netanyahu, we now know we've gone past the point of too much for Joe Biden, for Antony Blinken, for Chuck Schumer. Though that some of the numbers that may be relevant, 1.1 million people in Gaza currently struggling with catastrophic hunger and starvation. The death toll believed to be in excess of 30,000, 1.7 million people displaced. I'll say that again because sometimes the numbers are almost too big to comprehend. 1.7 million people displaced, 30-odd thousand people killed. And then, of course, the other numbers matter too. 1,200 people killed by Hamas on October the 7th, 253 taken hostage. I think just shy of 32,000, the official number to have been killed in Gaza since Israel launched its retaliatory offensive to eliminate Hamas. You can question those numbers if you want. I don't think you should. I don't think you need to. I think that the fact that the Palestinian deaths are often listed by name is fair, and international news organizations consider them to be reliable, but it doesn't mean I have to or that you have to. You can insist that they're not true and can't be trusted. And I can remind you that Israel's English language government spokesman has been suspended for an apparent economy with the actuality. So you see how easy it is to say you can't trust anything they say and you can't trust anything they say. But what we do know is this: the point of no support, or the point of no return, or the point of no more has been reached by America, and yet those of us who've been following it from the outside can't really see that anything has changed. So what has changed?